Again, this was created to show why the Marshall Islands entity is great, right? Some of these things you might be looking for the opposite, and you'd put an X on the Marshall Islands column and a check mark somewhere else, and you may be looking for other things. But I think this list on the left side of the page, and I'm going to go through how that list of considerations, what they are, and how they apply in some different examples. These are probably the things you want to think about. There are at least a lot of the things you want to think about when you're comparing entities. So you could apply the same methodology to a Singapore entity, right? Or some other entity or structure that you're considering. So I'm just going to go down this and kind of speak to some of these elements. And again, I'll try to take 10 minutes or so and leave time for Q&A, maybe even less. So, first of all, there's this question of, do you want to go somewhere that has a DAO or crypto specific law? And maybe in Swiss, I should put a question mark actually instead of an X, because Europe does have a crypto law, MiCA. There's no specific legal entity law for DAOs or Web3, but you do have a crypto framework. And one of the interesting things when you're comparing jurisdictions is, for example, a lot of people like the Marshall Islands because there are almost no laws about tokens, right? We have the DAO and Web3 laws. We have a VASP law, and then there's no other rules about tokens. There's some securities laws. And so a lot of people say, well, that's great. I can do anything I want. And that is great. But then other people might say, well, I want to be somewhere where there is already a token law and regulation that applies to my specific project or use case, right? Maybe it's a gambling related law. Maybe it's a law related to a DeFi related law, right? And I want there to be a law already, and I want to follow that law and know that I'm already all set. Now, in the Marshall Islands, there's no plan to pass restrictive laws. Everything we do, I'm a co-writer of all the laws. The whole point is to be friendly to crypto. But there's a little bit of a risk, right? What happens if one day we do pass a law and now you're already there and you didn't know what the law was ahead of time, right? So you can look at that different ways. US legal nexus. So that's a big one a lot of people are thinking about. That basically means how much are you tying yourself to the US? And you can't always avoid it, right? For example, if you have users or developers or investors in the US, that's creating some US legal nexus. But usually projects want to minimize their US legal nexus because of the risks that are perceived in terms of the US regulatory environment. And so if you create a Wyoming entity or a Delaware entity, you're just increasing your legal nexus in the United States, making it easier for the US to enforce things against you. Now, will that change in the Trump administration? I think so, to some extent. In some ways, for certain types of projects, we won't know, right, until Congress actually passes laws in the next couple of years, hopefully, that create some clarity, and maybe people will be less afraid of the US. So often the first question for a project is, do we want a US entity? And I'm speaking again from a US-centric point of view. I'm in California, right? But wherever you are, do you want to use a local entity or do you need to? For example, if almost all the activity of your project is in the United States or many other jurisdictions, let's say 75% of your founders, developers, and users and activity somehow is in the United States, you're actually expected by the IRS to use a US entity for that project. And if you use a foreign entity, they might actually disregard it for tax purposes, right? So it's really for truly global projects, either today or soon, that you can look anywhere in the world and say, I'm going to pick the best entity and the best jurisdiction for me. But for a lot of projects, if they are global, they're choosing to go outside the US or both, right? Have a US entity and a foreign entity, or a local Swiss entity and a foreign entity, whatever it is. So when I talk about these entities, I'm talking about your offshore option, right? When you're picking between any option in the world. So another one to look at is the trustees, directors, managers, et cetera, right? Some entity types like foundations, corporations, regular LLCs require you to have a management team, require you to have officers. Often, like in the case of foundations, require you to have an independent local director that you pay thousands of dollars a year, if not more, who is partly in charge of your organization. So my philosophy was always in Web3, and by the way, this is what a lot of big projects have done because it was the only option for a long time. Like there's a foundation that is in charge of the DAO's money and operations. And they've often signed a contract that says, we will do what the token holders tell us to do, except XYZ, or if it's illegal or unethical, or we can't do it or whatever. And to me, that's just not autonomous, right? That you're just moving farther away from what we all care about and believe in crypto in terms of DAOs and just how to operate things. If you're putting a small group of people in charge of your intellectual property, bank accounts, right? Anything off chain, why would you do that if you could simply give direct control to the community, to the token holders, which is what the DAO LLC allows you to do. So the reason there's a question mark in the Duna column is because the Duna has something called a supervisor, which is they've kind of tried to minimize the power you put on this position. And by the way, a lot of DAOs do want to have some people, maybe you call them managers, but you limit their power, or they can be unelected anytime, or maybe there's a security council, right? Maybe there's other things. It's not like DAOs never want to have any kind of centralized structure. But again, you just want to think about, is the structure you're looking at going to require you to have a board, and what are the implications of that from a values and practical standpoint? Is there a tax-free nonprofit option? So in the US, LLCs are always for profit. You're always going to be taxed, right? And it's one reason people go offshore is for the compelling tax treatment of foundations and the nonprofit DAO LLC in the Marshall Islands. No taxes, no pass-through taxes. You got to spend all your money on your mission. You can still pay managers and members for doing work and others for doing work, but all your money has to go to your mission and you don't pay any taxes. Question mark for the Duna, because the Duna, even though it has nonprofit in the name, is taxed as a for-profit corporation. And it's still to be determined if a Duna will be able to apply for 501c3 status in the United States. And apologies again if people don't know what that is. But basically, you first have to set up your Duna, have some business activity, and then apply for nonprofit status and find out months later if you get it. And no one's done it yet. So we just don't know if it's ever going to happen. Wrapping the entire DAO. This kind of goes to, what I talked about before in terms of like, do you just want to have 3 people technically in charge of your company on a board? And then they've promised to do what the DAO wants them to do usually? Or do you want to actually have token holders be members of the company? And by the way, I'm not a lawyer. Maybe I should have covered that at the beginning. I'm a tech entrepreneur who got into this business, and I've written laws and I'm helping people building a legal services business. Not a lawyer. Obviously, we work with tons of lawyers. You should hire a lawyer if you can, right? Hopefully you can see this is a complicated decision. It has long-term implications. It's hard to switch entities, although not impossible per se. And lawyers can help you think through, and tax advisors like Cameron, what are all the implications of these different structures? And for example, a complicated one is, well, if there's a foundation and the token holders are not members of the company, do they get liability protection from the corporate veil? And in what cases do they and don't they? Now, you could argue, well, they're just users. Users are not going to be held liable for like what goes wrong with Amazon, right? I mean, depending on what's in the terms of service. But then in a DAO LLC, these token holders are actually members of the company, right? They're part of that corporate shield. And so it's more direct in that sense. In terms of that corporate veil protection. Anonymous membership again. So like Cayman, Panama, Swiss, your foundation board is going to be completely KYC'd. Token holders are not, because they're not members of the company in the first place. And then like a Delaware LLC, most LLCs in the world, the company has to know the names and addresses of its members. It's just the way the laws were written. But the DAO LLC and the Duna allow you to have anonymous members of the company, but through their holding of a token. You could call it pseudonymous, right? But it's through holding a token. Local law firm and nominee required. This is a big one that actually, depending on who your lawyers are, they might not emphasize this point for you, but you should ask, for any legal entity you're going to create, do we have to hire a local law firm? And do we have to hire any other local service providers, accountants, independent directors to sit on the board? These entities, like one thing that's common, still people do this, like Fenwick and others do this, is Cayman and BVI. So you're talking about not only 2 jurisdictions that both require you to hire a local law firm in addition to your law firm, a local independent director, and local service providers, and you have to deal with the complexity of having 2 different entities. Now, why do they do that? Because they like the Cayman Foundation governance structure. It's been used in VC for a long time, and even crypto for a long time, but they like the BVI token laws. So of course, in the Marshall Islands, we say, just come to the Marshall Islands where we have the good governance structure and the good token laws and all these other benefits. But I'll jump to the last line on here, which is the Lindy effect. If anyone hasn't heard of it, you look up Lindy effect in crypto. The idea is that the longer something's been around, the more likely it is to survive for a long time, and kind of just the more people trust it. And I think you got to give it to Cayman, BVI, Swiss, and a regular Delaware LLC, for example. It's been around forever. The other benefit to that, aside from just being around forever, and expecting it to be around forever is the ecosystem, right? Cayman and Swiss, you have massive ecosystems, partly because you're required to hire these people, but massive ecosystems of lawyers, accountants, tax people, independent directors, et cetera. You know, we have people that want to have an independent manager for a DAO LLC because you're allowed to have a manager if you want to. We actually will often send them to a Cayman firm, Cayman firms we partner with who know how to be a good independent manager, and they'll serve as an independent manager on the Marshall Islands entity because we don't have a big bench of service providers doing that in the Marshall Islands for crypto. I'm going to try to stop in a second, and then if you guys want to ask about other things that are on this slide, happy to go into it. You can consider whether the jurisdiction you're looking at is on any international blacklists and whether that concerns you. Panama is usually the one that comes up in that regard because they have some terrorist activity there. But still people use that entity sometimes. Can you pass KYB, right? I mean, and this is the signing contracts question. Most any entity you can do that. It's always hard in crypto to open a bank account, as many of you probably know. Duna is maybe the one question mark because Duna is actually an unregistered entity. You do not file anything with the government when you create it, and they don't keep a database of the Dunas, and that means if a bank looks up in their database trying to confirm that the Duna really exists, they have no way to do that. Whereas every other entity you can look up in a registry and make sure it exists. And so I've heard that some banks actually might work with unincorporated nonprofit associations. They kind of specialize on it, but most, especially globally, probably will not.